I am Maha El-Birani. I grew up here in London, Ontario, from the age of 2 until 25. I now work in humanitarian aid with Syrian refugees in Lebanon. I am a domestic homicide survivor, at least that's what the journal articles call me, and I will be sharing with you some insights on an immigrant's perspective and experience with language, cultural, and other barriers that make it more difficult to report domestic violence and access services. This is my dear and sweet mama, Sonia. She was murdered by my father in April 2012 after 29 years of oppression and abuse. I would like to introduce you to Mama by quoting my older sister. Mama was beautiful inside and out. Her eyes were the color of emerald jewels, and they sparkled through all the pain they carried. Her skin was so soft, and her hands were so elegantly beautiful. She was a teacher early in her career and later went back to college part-time while working full-time to get a diploma in early childhood education at the age of 49. She then shifted careers and became a daycare worker, helping many mothers to raise their young children. 6 months before she was killed, she began a job with the London Middlesex Health Unit as a family home visitor. She would work with a newly arrived family into Canada that needed help finding resources, maybe a new mother feeling overwhelmed, needing a helping hand or some encouragement and guidance. Sadly, she was not able to do this for long. She was strong yet delicate, confident yet so humble, kind and so wise. She was a loving daughter, sister, mother, grandmother, teacher, and caregiver. She was so much to so many people. She was my best friend and my hero. Mama grew up in a small town in Lebanon with a strong sense of community, belonging, and a very big family. She had 10 brothers and sisters, and she loved and respected her parents, and especially her father, very much. My grandfather was an agricultural engineer working in the Ministry of Agriculture, and my grandmother was a homemaker. Mama was a very intelligent child. She skipped the 3rd grade. She told me she remembered my grandfather took her out that day, just the two of them, for a 7-Up in celebration, and she felt so special. Mama was a teacher. She taught French in Lebanon. She married my father, a history teacher, when she was 21 in 1982. At the time, Lebanon was in the middle of its 15-year-long civil war that ended in 1990. The civil war in Lebanon had many factions and led to high levels of corruption in all public institutions and authorities that the country still suffers from today. My father was abusive from the beginning of their marriage. Mama was extremely principled and always believed that protecting your family's reputation was very important. In 1989, my parents immigrated to London, Ontario, Canada, to seek better work opportunities. The civil war in Lebanon had inflated the Lebanese lira so much that their salaries as teachers was worth less than the gas it took to drive to work. Mama said sometimes we would have 1 potato for dinner, so she would feed my father and sister, breastfeed me, and go to bed hungry herself. Mama was 28 when she came to London, with 3 young daughters and an abusive husband. We moved to London where we had some extended family on my father's side. She only spoke French and Arabic, so she started with some ESL classes. My father was soon diagnosed with clinical depression with some paranoia. He attempted suicide around this time, and Mama had to quit her job working at the counter of a donut shop to take care of him. I wanted to go into all of these details so we could put ourselves in Mama's shoes. She has left her big family and community with 3 young daughters and a mentally ill husband. She does not speak the language nor have any support system in her new home. She is a very intelligent and independent woman that came from a well-respected family. She's not used to asking for help and relies on her own abilities to make it through. She is very nurturing and compassionate, so she takes care of everyone around her, including her abusive husband, because of his mental illness. She sees him as a sick man. She is also coming from a country where authorities are not trustworthy or supportive. In fact, a domestic violence law wasn't passed until 2014 in Lebanon. As the years passed, we adapted and made the best of our situation. Mama was working in daycares and going to college in the nights. We were playing with our friends in the neighborhood, and my father was usually home. He would play cards with his friends in the late evening. He would see his brothers sometimes. He said he couldn't handle the pressures of work. He would have episodes where he would spend much of his time crying. He started physically abusing my older sister around this time. She was a young teen. In 1999, Mama took us to live in Lebanon for 2 years. My father stayed behind in Canada. If he left, he wouldn't be eligible for his disability compensation that he was receiving. We lived in a small village for those 2 years. We connected to our heritage, language, community, and country. When we returned to Canada in 2001, my father's behavior was extremely controlling and erratic. He would have many bad days where he would control what we did. We would turn the home phone ringer off to silent, and we would hope no one would randomly stop by. He wouldn't allow Mama to work and controlled our spending and lives. My sister and I weren't allowed to join any extracurricular activities at school. He would sometimes cause scenes or display this behavior in front of his siblings or other members of the community, and then we would be held accountable by the community. My aunt would come to ask me, why did your father do that? We started to isolate ourselves. We would feel dread at any community event. What if he embarrasses us again? The community also started to leave us out of things. Our uncles would rent a hall and have a gathering to celebrate Eid, or to go for the day to Niagara Falls or Canada's Wonderland and not invite us. If our relatives from out west or from Lebanon came to visit, they would not inform us. So again, we made the best of our situation. Mama started working again, despite my father's orders, and we became closer as mother and daughters, trying not to poke the bear, wake the beast, or step on a mine. We altered our life and behavior to minimize any of his episodes. We operated as an independent unit, isolated from society and our community and extended family. We can do this was always our attitude. If he would just change one day, we could be a happy family. One day in April 2005, I woke up at 5 a.m. to put final edits on a grade 12 social studies essay that was due the next day. I remember the teacher saying to the class she would not accept any late submissions under any circumstances. While working away on the family computer, my father started a fight with my older sister by joking that she should throw her 11-month-old baby off the balcony. He stood towering over her and her son. I tried to protect her by separating them from each other. We rushed to the bedroom to get dressed and ready and out of the house before the tensions escalated. Mama had already left for work. My younger sister went to the kitchen to prepare a bottle for the baby, and we heard screaming. My father had gotten a broomstick to beat us with. He told us we were not to attend school that day because we were bad. He threw my older sister and her babies out of the apartment without shoes, and he kept my younger sister and me inside, swinging the wooden broomstick at our legs and midsections if we were in his way. We called Mama to let her know what was happening. She rushed home to try to convince him to let us out. He did not allow her through the door, and he ripped her headscarf off as he threw her out into the building hallway. At this point, my sister and I saw no way out. We called the police. My father was arrested and charged for physical assault. There was an automatic restraining order put on him so that he could not return home. I want to highlight here that the abuse had been going on for years until we finally called the police once. As I'm sure you know better than I do, there's a lot of literature on the fact that immigrants are far less likely to contact the police for assistance, especially in reporting crimes or other problem situations. So they're a lot less likely to seek contact with the police. And particularly as Lebanese people, we have a very entrepreneurial and do-it-yourself attitude. We have also never had leaders of integrity or any experience with trustworthy authorities in our own country. So since there was a reported and charged physical assault in our family, police and victim services had direct access to our home. At this point, I feel a few things could and should have been done. Perhaps a caseworker should have been assigned to our home to follow up on the situation. Perhaps our school should have been notified and we should have been seeing school counselors. Unfortunately, none of this happened. My father was charged and assigned an anger management course. He went to live with his brother for a few weeks. One day my uncle came for a visit and he begged Mama to take him back. He said he was causing problems in his household. When she wasn't convinced, another uncle visited us and said if we could just take him back for a few weeks, they were going to find him an apartment for him to live in. Mama finally agreed. They dropped him off and we never saw them again. They shunned us from the family and community because we had their brother arrested. We were villains from that day on. So my father attended his anger management course. Once he completed it, the organization sent a letter to Mama saying that he never showed any regret or remorse for his actions. We wondered how this meant he had completed the course. But things were calmer at home, so we minimized, normalized, accommodated, and adapted, as we were used to doing, further isolated from our community. In fact, my best friend's parents would no longer allow her to visit my home. So after calling the police, he was back home. We were further shamed in our community, and the situation became worse. In such a vulnerable state, would you call them again? Time and life went on. I earned my bachelor's in chemical engineering from Western University. Mama earned an early childhood education diploma from Fanshawe. My sister studied her master's in Western and religious thought at McMaster University. I worked at a natural gas distribution company. Mama worked as a teacher in a daycare, and my sister worked part-time at a chiropractor's office. We continued our "we can do this" attitude, surviving and waiting until he would change, disappear, or die. 2 years before the murder, my father had tried to break Mama's neck. My sister and I pulled him off of her. We called our uncles for help, as they had expressed that they wished we would have done that instead of calling the police in 2005. And they sent their sister to our home to tell us that they did not want to get involved. As my aunt left, my sister told her if they did not help us, someone would leave our house in a body bag, and it would probably be Mama. She asked my uncles to meet with her later in the week, but they stood her up. My father had always been unemployed, and Mama, my sister, and I always worked to support the household. Was it fair that we have to leave our home because he was a horrible person? I used to try to think of ways to make him leave. My head would hurt trying to think of a solution. None of the solutions were fair. Should my parents get divorced? Should we go to a women's shelter? Should we all move out and leave him? Would he follow us? All of the solutions I could think of resulted in us giving up everything and still living in fear. I want to mention here the option of divorce. While it's permissible in our religion to divorce, culturally it's shameful. A girl from a broken home will have more difficulties getting married, and this is an important part of traditional societies. So this was a major cultural barrier to us leaving. My father had a therapist he saw monthly or quarterly for over a decade. He was diagnosed with clinical depression and needed to see the therapist to get prescriptions for his medications. A few weeks before the murder, Mama called the therapist to tell him that things were getting bad in our home and asked him if he was getting any indication of other issues my father may have been having. He told her that my father never spoke at his sessions. He would remain silent for the hour, take his prescription, and leave. I wonder, where was his due diligence? The therapist told Mama, if he ever gets violent, just call the police. But what if he was too violent, and what if it was too late to call the police? In April 2012, our worst fear was realized. He was too violent, and when my sister and I returned home from our friends on the night of the 11th, it was too late. Mama was by the door, stabbed 25 times, and bled out to death. I hope that sharing my experience with you shines a new light on how to work with and help families in similar situations as ours. The situation is very complex, and culture and background is a very important aspect to be sensitive to. In the words of the justice that sentenced my father to 25 years in prison for the crime of second-degree murder, you have every right to be angry. Anger is not necessarily a negative emotion. We need anger to make sure we defend those who are defenseless. We need anger to motivate us to change people's impressions of domestic violence and to end complacency. So anger, hang on to it, but make it a good anger. Make it a positive anger. Thank you.
Well, first of all, let me say how honored I am to be here. It has been an awesome day. I have learned so much. And if any of our opening panel are still here, I'll hear your words in my head forever. And I cried a lot this morning. And I told somebody today, I guess when I stop crying, that I ought to get out of the work. So we're charged with addressing safety planning for vulnerable populations. And when I heard the opening this morning from the elder, I didn't know much, I have to admit, about the 7 fires prophecy. So of course you Google it, right? And I found out some more. But I'm feeling like we are probably in an era where we do have to make those choices as a global planet, as a global people. And especially for someone in the States, I feel particularly vulnerable to a country's government that seems absolutely bent and determined to do more to befoul the earth and, make our waters full of disrespect. And that it's my country seems to want to go down the path of more prosperity for the few. And so does our world, rather than a good life for everyone. So, I'm going to keep that in my head and do everything I can to change the policy in my country. I like a lot of what Canada is doing now. I'm always tempted to move north, except what keeps me, of course, in my country is these grandchildren. So all of you that have heard me talk, I always start out with pictures of the grandchildren. And my piece here is to ask all of you, if anybody after the presentation has any thoughts of how I get those incredibly privileged grandchildren to really deeply recognize their privilege and to recognize the biases that I know they're growing up with. My daughter says, well, Mom, you taught us not to be racist. But I'm like, yeah, but see, that's not good enough. You have to live it. You have to think about it every day. So if you have any tips for me, let me know. Now, what I'm supposed to do is talk about safety planning for vulnerable and marginalized populations. What Myrna told me is the way it's defined in this homicide prevention initiative is Aboriginal populations, immigrant populations, rural, remote. I would say we ought to add the LGBTQ continuum to that also. Now, I'll confess from the outset, I got nothing for you in terms of rural and remote. The Intimate Partner Femicide study was done primarily on urban populations. There's a few rural cases in there. But I am thrilled that there are so many people here that are thinking about it, and I'm looking to my colleague, Donna, to address it in this presentation. The danger assessment, which many of you know about, was developed for women. It's in order to help women recognize the danger in their relationship with an abusive man. Now, part of the danger assessment, in terms of its history, I first developed it based on a small domestic violence homicide study in Dayton, Ohio, small town. And based on the work I did in that study, I realized I needed to work with abused women if I was ever going to decrease murder of women. And so I started on a journey doing that, working in leading support groups and shelters in Detroit first and then in other places in the country. And also teaching my students, my nursing students, to recognize abused women in their practice, talking to a lot of abused women and realizing they oftentimes were underestimating their risk of being killed. They would tell me the story and I'd think, oh my goodness, it sounds way too much like one of those homicide cases I reviewed. But yet, I'm more scared than she is. And that's when I learned to recognize clinically that normal minimization, put it in the back of your head kind of process that women do, abused women do. And not all of them are at high risk, but those that are oftentimes underestimate their risk. So I developed the danger assessment, getting the wording for the items, and it's available on the website. It's available for free. They promised me even if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, it'll be up there for free. I've sold my soul, not totally, but the rights to Hopkins so that it will always be available. And the wording of the danger assessment came from the women. The notion of choking strangulation went on the danger assessment back in 1986 because women told me that that was one thing that scared them. That was one thing that made them think he might be capable of killing her. And the original danger assessment, I've done the danger assessment myself with 2,200 women that I have records of, and probably more than that. So I've used it, and one of the most important parts of the danger assessment is the calendar. This makes it interactive. This helps her come to her own realization of the pattern of domestic violence. It cuts through that normal minimization. Now, the calendar is built on the notion that she's strong, resourceful, smart. And like all adult learners, we learn much better. It's much more powerful if we see it for ourselves in our own situation rather than somebody telling us what to do. And this is a quote from a woman in Alberta, Canada. You actually see your own roller coaster ride. It's on the calendar. Now, it was further refined in the national U.S. domestic violence femicide study. Tested with ROC curve analysis, all of that's available, and all of the articles related to the danger assessment are on the danger assessment website. We have also developed a version for immigrant women, DAI. Immigrant women, again, in the United States, so it hasn't been tested further, needs further development and testing. We're working on that right now. But that's also available on the danger assessment website. We also have a DAR for same-sex female couples, and that we're continuing to work on also. We also have a DA5, which is a short form for healthcare providers. It was actually developed mostly by a Canadian physician, Carolyn Snyder, who's now in Toronto. We have revised and worked on that further, and we have a publication coming out on that in 2018. The DALE was developed in collaboration with the Jeannie Geiger Crisis Center in order to help them identify which cases of domestic violence needed to be handled by a high-risk team. So it's calibrated slightly differently than the other danger assessments in order to do that. That DALE also, there's a publication coming out on that, but that's available on the danger assessment website. But that's more around identifying cases that need heavy-duty, highly collaborative risk management. It's also in the DOVE intervention, which is for pregnant women in prenatal, either home visitation or prenatal care. That intervention has been tested and found to significantly reduce repeat domestic violence. That's also being used in the NFP, which is the family partnership. It's the home visitation program. Oh, David Olds was just nurse family partnership. Got it. And Dana Jack and Marilyn Ford-Gilbo are using the danger assessment in their home visitation programs, and they're developing an intervention specifically for NFP nurses to do with domestic violence victim. The LAP is a short form of the danger assessment, and note it's a lethality assessment protocol. It's not just a lethality assessment. There's a protocol that goes with it. And sometimes you hear people say, oh, well, we use the LAP. You know, we just ask these questions, and there we go. We know who's at high risk. The protocol that goes with it is that the police officer informs the woman or the survivor, and they're using it with males as well as females, that they are at high risk. According to the LAP, it's calibrated to overestimate risk. And gets them in touch with domestic violence advocacy right there on the scene. Doesn't give them a phone number to call that they don't, but gets them in touch with domestic violence advocates right there on the scene. Offers them the phone, they don't have to talk, but that's the protocol part. So it's not just, and you may notice, all of these are intended to connect women at high risk with domestic violence services so she can make choices what to do. Wanted to give you a little bit of data from my collaboration with the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters. Carolyn Gerard is out there somewhere. This project we did many years ago, but we wanted to keep track of what happened when the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters decided that the danger assessment would be used in all of their shelters as women were admitted within the first 48 to 72 or 24 to 72 hours after admission. So domestic violence advocates were concerned about doing that with the danger assessment. They were particularly concerned about the calendar, concerned that it would re-traumatize women. So that was in part why we embarked on this research. 46% of the participants in this research were Aboriginal, 31% English Canadian, other visible minorities 7%, and 5% foreign born. So importantly, the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters wanted to modify the calendar, which anybody's free to do, anything they want to do to make it better for women to fill out. They wanted to add emotional abuse as well as the physical abuse, the 1 through 5 on the calendar. They wanted to add emotional abuse, financial abuse, sexual assault, and spiritual abuse, and how often that happened, and put it on the calendar. One thing that we're doing now with all of our calendars is actually adding when choking or strangulation happens on the calendar. So we had 180 respondents who gave us in-depth, it wasn't in-depth interviews, it was they gave us the answer to open-ended questions about what it was like for you to complete the danger assessment and the calendar. And the thematic analysis, first of all, a lot of women said, yeah, it's hard to do. It's distressing, it's upsetting. A lot of women cried. But it was also part of a healing process. First of all, by increasing awareness, decreasing minimization. I love that quote about I'm always trying to minimize my experiences, and she hadn't even been to support group yet. So I don't know how she learned that terminology. So she already had that in her head. But then also women talking about it being a healing experience. I love that in terms of loosen my breathing, which we know is something that we do when we do finally start to relax. Also increase their realization of danger. And the theme of strengthening resolve, those quotes, and those are just examples of quotes, there was many other women that said something like this, is what makes me feel like the danger assessment is worth doing in terms of strengthening women's resolve. So also we measured the outcomes, and those of you that are researchers in the room, this was lousy research. It was pre-post only. It was, it's not, no control group, none of that good stuff, no follow-up over time, but just pre-post in terms of women marking their danger more after doing the danger assessment. Well, that makes sense. But the ready to take action, significantly more. Ready to get help from the shelter personnel and ready to get help from police. So based on that work with Alberta Council of Women's Shelters, we also worked with the Indigenous shelter directors and their staff in order to make the danger assessment more culturally appropriate for Indigenous women in the on-reserve shelters. And so they came up with the DA Circle design. It's part of the Walking the Path project that was for children who were in homes where there had been domestic violence, Indigenous children. So it was designed to be a little bit more culturally appropriate. using culturally significant symbols on the calendar, and also doing the calendar in a month process, more appropriate, not month, a season process, more appropriate to a medicine wheel type concept. And women, rather than the regular danger assessment calendar, women are asked to work backwards, starting with yesterday, and work backwards because we remember yesterday better than further back. But to take advantage of the more storytelling traditions, women were told to dive into any season they wanted to and work backwards and forwards within that season to mark the abusive incidents, as is done on the regular danger assessment. Now, we have not formally tested the DA circle, but the notion of safety planning based in part, at least, on the danger assessment is that women are aware of the level of danger in their situation, their risk of homicide. That's one piece of information that they need in order to do safety planning, I believe. And ideally coming to that realization herself rather than being told. But if she is told, if it's by a healthcare provider or the police or a domestic violence advocate, look, you're at high risk. If you do the weighted scoring on the danger assessment, you're at extreme danger. That this gives her a voice saying, and she may have suspected it all along. We have some quotes from some other women. One woman said, "Hey, this is no news flash. I knew he was scary. But this does give me some backing to push the system more." So then the safety planning you can do is based in part on how dangerous he is. And then the safety planning needs to be contextualized to her situation, to her culture, to other sources of discrimination and violence against her, so that it's not just about her personal situation, so that it's also the context has to take into account. And Diane Redsky was talking today about her program, the Spirit of Peace program, which I think is awesome, where and she can talk to you more about it if you're interested. Then we developed the My Plan app. Now, Nancy Glass, my colleague, my friend, was the one that first developed the My Plan app, but the danger assessment is in it. And importantly, I don't know if this will work, yeah. So the danger assessment, the woman is asked, first of all, a little bit about her background. If she says she's in a relationship with another woman, and there's problems in the relationship, there's some first identification that the relationship has issues. The word violence is avoided at the beginning. Let me back up a little bit. It can also be done by a family member or a friend. So if it's not by the woman herself and it identifies that at first, starts off with internet safety, app safety strategies, et cetera. There's a get out of this app and go to a planning your, I don't know what it is, your work life or something. It goes straight to that if you want it to. So there is some safety strategies built into that app. You can also see the little leaf that's on the front of it, and it just says My Plan. So it's not it doesn't scream out abuse or circle of safety or anything like that. And then it asks her what her priorities are in life. Are her priorities her children? Which, every abused woman I've ever talked to that has children, that's number one. But if she doesn't have children, then the safety planning that's offered is not about children. And then after it goes through some relationship myths, and that's one of the things we're tailoring to Indigenous women in our work with the My Plan. Then it asks the questions that are on the danger assessment, and it scores it for her. And you can see there, it gives where she is on the levels of danger. And we did some work with some women that said, 6 months later, they said, oh, I was in the red zone. I remember that about that app. I don't remember anything else, but I do remember I was in the red zone. So it's a powerful message of where she is in terms of risk of homicide. Then it tailors, and it's brilliant programming. James Case is the person that programmed it. It tailors the safety strategies that are offered to her, to that background information, to her priorities, and to her level of danger. And so this does not take the place of domestic violence advocacy, but it's an extra tool that we can use for people that aren't ready to talk to you wonderful, fabulous, best people advocates. And that's always one of the choices that's given, is in the United States, it's the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Now there's a Canadian version called I CAN that Marilyn Ford Gilbo has developed, and they've done an evaluation of it. Those results are in, it's not yet published, and they're eventually planning to get it in the App Store also. The only one that's in the App Store now, both kinds of app stores, is the My Plan. It's also iSafe in New Zealand, and the evaluation of iSafe in New Zealand was very effective for Maori women, even though it was not specifically tailored that way. So what we're doing now in the United States, we're trying to develop an Indigenous version of My Plan. I have a team of Indigenous researchers that are in charge of it. We started out with in-depth interviews of service providers and abused Indigenous women. It will have the DA circle in there for the danger assessment. By the way, in My Plan, if you say you're in a relationship with another woman, you get the DAR rather than the regular danger assessment. We're tailoring the priorities, the myths, the safety planning strategies for Indigenous women in the United States. We'll get to Canada one of these days. And we're also doing the same thing with the same grant money from NIH, so we can't go global. But and we're calling it, by the way, Our Circle. You can see a pattern in these things. And the immigrant version of My Plan is going to be called We Women. And it's based on the danger assessment for immigrant women, doing the same kinds of cultural adaptation as for Our Circle. Like, for instance, in Our Circle, a lot of the safety planning strategies are reconnecting with your spiritual practices, your traditional practices, those kinds of things like what I've been hearing about today. I CAN, that team here in Canada, like I said, the findings are in press, and there's an I HEAL online strategy that was also developed by Marilyn Ford Gilbo for healing after abuse. And there's a team in BC, Colleen Varco and her team, working with Aboriginal women for healing after abuse. And I do believe healing from the trauma has to be part of safety planning strategies, that we have to pay attention to healing. And I think we have to pay attention to that in our prevention programs, our dating violence prevention programs. We have to pay attention to people's experiences of trauma, whether they're Aboriginal or immigrant coming from another land, etc. That has to be part of our safety planning strategies. And I finished on time. What do you think?
So I've been asked to focus on immigrant and refugee women. So I'm going to talk about immigrant and refugee women and the kind of particular key challenges they face in dealing with domestic violence. Here, I am going to particularly focus on intimate partner violence, not the other kinds of domestic violence forms. I want to highlight a few key challenges that we need to keep in mind in safety planning with immigrant and refugee women who experience intimate partner violence. Before I do so, I want to highlight the fact that there is still very little published research on safety planning for and with immigrant and refugee women in Canada, in the Canadian context. One of the reasons for this is, I believe, this assumption that safety planning is safety planning. How can they be different? Before coming here in preparation of this presentation, I asked some of my research assistants to go and talk to some of the social service and settlement workers about what kind of safety planning do they do in preparation of, keeping and helping immigrant women living or staying in intimate partner violence relationships. Often they were told, well, what's different? It's the same, safety planning is safety planning. My talk is based on the kind of research that I have been doing with immigrant women. It's been for over 20 years that I have been working with immigrant communities, focusing on immigrant women's health. A considerable portion of this research was on intimate partner violence. And in case if you are interested in learning more about the research that I have done in different immigrant and refugee communities, feel free to go to www.immigrant.healthresearch.ca. It's one word, immigrant.healthresearch.ca.com. Doesn't matter. Anyways, so I want to start with a project that I did recently, 2 years ago. I conducted focus groups in 6 languages with immigrant women in Toronto who had experienced intimate partner violence. And women across all 6 language groups said that they had never received information about their rights in Canada, and they did not know where to get such information. Some of you may disagree with me, but these are the women who came to these focus groups who had experienced intimate partner violence telling me. And more than half of these women had been in the country for more than 5 years, and all of them had spent that time in Toronto, of all the places where you would think there are plenty of social service settlement agencies working with immigrant women. And so I want to ask you this question: whose responsibility is it to make this information available to all women coming to Canada in a language the women can understand? And at a time, they can actually digest such information. If we wait to give this information to the women after they have experienced intimate partner violence at a moment of crisis, it may be too late for some women. Moving on, let's say they know their rights in Canada. Who will ensure that they will have their rights honored? The women in my studies told us again and again that they personally knew other women who had gone to service providers and were subsequently sent to immigration officers and were then deported back to their countries of origin. When they know this, would they go and seek help? So what crime did these women do to be deported back to their countries? They came forward to ask for help to deal with domestic violence. I still recall the horrific situation a woman went through in dealing with her abusive husband. She said that one day, after all of these things happened to her, after her children went to school, she went to the closest immigration office and stood outside crying for 2 hours, trying to decide what's worse. What should she do? Going inside or going home? After 2 hours of thinking through the situation, she said she went home to her abusive husband. Imagine what must have gone through this woman's mind. And when we talk about safety planning, what should we be thinking about in working with a woman like this? Some women in my studies have said that the police officers who respond to their 911 call listen to their husbands who were fluent in English, and were convinced that women were the abusers. Some women talked about being put in jail with no access to a translator or an interpreter for days. Some talked about going to court with translators who were assigned to them who were not fluent in their language or who knew their husband well, thus jeopardized their case by not translating accurately. As a result, some had lost custody of their children. Some women talked about their close friends who were sent back to their home countries while their abusive husbands remained in Canada with their Canadian-born children. And these women are back home and working hard to send financial support for their children in Canada. These women's rights have been violated time and time again, yet we often focus on culture blaming. To me, this is about how we, as a society, continue to fail these women. You may be aware that immigrant women who are equally skilled and equally educated as their husbands get much less pay when employed in the same job in Canada. You may be aware that even when an immigrant woman and her husband have equal job skills and equal education and training, the Canadian government automatically places the woman in the position of the dependent. Why? This happens even when the woman has more education, more employability, and more language skills. I'll give you an example. Many years back, my husband and I decided to apply for Canadian citizenship. I filled out the citizenship application forms for both of us and mailed them in the same envelope. And at the time of this application, my husband was a full-time student. He was doing his PhD. Nonetheless, he was a student at the time. At the same university where I was a full-time tenured professor. And I had completed all my education, bachelor's, master's, PhD, and postdoctoral work in Canada, on top of my education in 2 other countries before coming to Canada. The letter we received from the citizenship office was sent to my husband, and I was placed as his wife. So it wasn't addressed to me, it wasn't addressed to both of us, it was addressed to my husband. So imagine the power the Canadian government officials had chosen to give to a husband. So this happens every day. This is not one rare incident. Now I also want to highlight a few key problems women face when they seek health, social, and settlement workers and other service providers' help. Often service providers focus on getting the woman to leave an abusive husband. A newcomer woman who is dependent on her husband to obtain her permanent residency in Canada may not want to leave her relationship until she obtains her permanent residency papers. This is a careful decision a woman might arrive at in order to make her and her children's life a bit more stable in Canada. Leaving her marital home is not an easy journey for immigrant and refugee women. Some immigrant women may be married to abusive men who were born in Canada. You may have heard about mail-order brides. And women may not know anybody other than their own husbands and children. Women risk losing their children and extended family, and along with that social, economic, and cultural safety, security that they might desperately need in a foreign land. Service providers' paternalistic approach in getting the women to leave an abusive husband, thinking that this will make everything all right, may not necessarily help the woman cope with the situation. In fact, this may mean the woman might not come back to seek help. Another issue I want to highlight is the lack of portability of services. Women seeking help may need access to housing, child support, legal support, help with immigration applications, language and employment training, or getting their credentials assessed. The service providers and women I interviewed often talk about the expectation that women have to come to them. Women have to go to the service provider to receive services. They see this issue in terms of a time factor, a geography factor, a commuting factor, a financial factor, and a legal factor. Look at the number of factors the service providers identify why they can't go to the communities that they work with. If a woman takes public transportation to get to an agency that provides services in her own language, depending on where she lives, she might need 1 to 2 hours to get there and meet with service providers and get back home. This is assuming that she knows about the place, she knows how to get there, and she has the financial means to get there. Women participants have also told me that their husbands would be calling home to check on them. So they are terrified, petrified to be gone for that long. There is no system in most places where health professionals, social workers, and settlement workers can meet women in their homes or nearby in order to improve women's access to service providers without jeopardizing women's safety. This is one of the key reasons why we should include families, deliberately include families and communities in safety planning. But of course, I am talking about these things based on my research in the Greater Toronto area. But in your geographical context, with the communities that you work with, this might be different. And this is also tied to another issue that we see often, the lack of connection and coordination between the various health, social service, and settlement organizations and other services. Often women talk about their frustration with having to go to so many different places and agencies, which are often located in different parts of the city in a place like Toronto, to get the support they need in planning their own and their children's safety. How can we make this easy for the women and their children to come and get help? Some of these may not be a surprise to you, but I raise them because as service providers, researchers, and policymakers, we need to pay attention to these. We need to go beyond the focus on culture and culture blaming. In conclusion, I urge all of us to advocate for systemic and structural solutions when we are thinking about safety planning so that immigrant and refugee women can feel safe in this great country. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Peter and Myrna, for the opportunity to speak here today. It's an honor to be speaking to you today and in this place, and with my esteemed co-panelists. Okay, so in its second domestic homicide brief, the initiative said that those conducting risk assessments should use structured, reliable, validated, and defensible risk assessment tools or guidelines. So the initiative doesn't have a position on which approach or which tool to be using. And you, at this conference, have been hearing about a number of tools that are structured, validated tools. And I'm going to be focusing on one approach, the actuarial approach, and in particular on the Ontario Domestic Assault Risk Assessment, or Adhara, which is an actuarial tool. So actuarial has to do with the statistical calculation of risk. It's an approach that's used in many fields, including the insurance industry and medical health, and as it turns out, in violence risk assessment as well. Actuarial methods have to do with measuring risks or potential risk factors at a given point in time, and then following up a sample or a group, in this case domestic offenders, for example, following them up and measuring the outcome as well, so that every item that's on an actuarial tool is a risk factor that has been shown to be measured at one time and related to an outcome at a later time. So this, an actuarial tool is scored. Each item on an actuarial tool has a score, and the total score is the conclusion of the tool to an extent is the sum of all the item scores, and that sum relates to an individual's estimated risk and also a rank order, so how an individual compares with other domestic offenders who have been assessed. So, as I said, actuarial tools are used in a variety of fields, including medical risk assessment. And I was actually able to go online and evaluate my own risk of developing breast cancer. So this tool allowed me to enter my individual level, my own information, and it told me two things. One, it told me what my risk of developing breast cancer is in my lifetime, up to the age of 90, which might be a little optimistic. But secondly, it also told me how my risk compares to others based on large studies. So an actuarial tool can tell you both individual information to help you either communicate to a victim that you're supporting, or help you make decisions about an individual perpetrator that you may be treating or deciding on a variety of different risk management strategies for. But it also helps at a more population level or a policy level, because planning can be made for how many people you may expect to need certain resources for. And in particular, actuarial tools fit with the risk, need, and responsivity principles, whereby we give the most risk management interventions or actions to those people who represent the highest risk of either perpetration or victimization. So the Adhara, being an actuarial tool, gives this kind of information. It can be presented in a figure like this. So for people who are comfortable with reading figures or enjoy the statistics, this table, this figure can tell us a number of things. First, it tells us that with increasing Adhara scores along the bottom, you see increasing risk of domestic violence recidivism. It also tells us that, shows that we have done a number of studies and found the same pattern, validating the Adhara in different studies. The line also shows the distribution, or a summary we can take from that is that at the extreme ends of risk, we see relatively fewer perpetrators. And this is based on research with male perpetrators of domestic violence. The results don't have to be displayed in a figure like this. They can also be summarized in a table that we would call an actuarial table. And here you would find the Adhara score down the first column, and you can look over to see an individual's estimated risk in the next column. And perhaps more importantly, the other columns also show where an individual stands with respect to others who have been assessed on the Adhara. It can also be communicated like this, and these pie charts were suggested to us by nurses who were working with female victims of domestic violence at Ontario's sexual assault and domestic violence treatment centres. They found this was a more user-friendly communication for their clients, but it still also shows the estimated risk in the shaded areas of the graph and where people stand with respect to each other by looking at the whole row, the whole column of the pie charts. It can also be expressed like this, which to me is quite user-friendly and very similar to what I received when I assessed my risk for developing breast cancer. So I've mentioned the Adhara. I haven't really talked about what the Adhara is other than an actuarial tool. This is a screenshot from Adhara 101, our online training for the tool. And this is a piece that you would see after doing the learning modules and when you've been through some practice videos and you get the opportunity to practice scoring the Adhara and each individual item. So the first few items have to do with the perpetrator's criminal history, such as prior domestic assault and a police or criminal record. The three items after that have to do with things that occurred at the most recent domestic assault, like threats, confinement, the victim's concern about future assaults. And the remaining items have to do with aspects of the relationship and the circumstances, their children, any assaults during pregnancy, barriers to accessing support, and so on. So that's just a brief summary of the Adhara. And now I would like to talk a little bit about choosing a risk assessment tool. I have just picked out 5 different principles in choosing a tool, and each agency or jurisdiction needs to choose the tool or the approach that is right for them, that's going to be the most effective in supporting their risk management procedures. So validation refers to whether a tool has been tested, especially in multiple studies, to make sure that the tool itself or the items on that tool or the summary statements from that tool are actually related to domestic violence recidivism in the case of the tools that we're talking about. And all the major tools that you're hearing about at this conference have been validated. I would include in validation inter-rater reliability or agreement. That is, if I score the Adhara in a particular situation and Peter scores the Adhara in the same situation, do we come up with the same score? Because if we are scoring the Adhara differently, if it's a different score every time, then it can't be used in a valid way. And we have done a number of studies on the Adhara finding that we have good agreement in that way. Generalization has to do with, okay, we've maybe validated the tool in one sort of population. Does it generalize to another population? So here's where we want to see studies done in different countries and so on, or in different settings, such as the victim advocacy setting or the police or corrections setting. Generalization also, in domestic violence risk assessment, there is a big issue with whether tools that are developed for male perpetrators with female victims will generalize to female perpetrators or to perpetrators and victims in a same-sex relationship. We do have a number of studies now validating the Adhara for female perpetrators, and we want to see more happening in that direction. And we are hoping to see more work done, or at least some work done with the Adhara in same-sex relationship violence. And that really is an area that is a current challenge for domestic violence risk assessment for all our tools. Information has to do with whether you have the information needed to complete the risk assessment tool or approach that you want to use. For example, the Adhara was developed for frontline use with victims or in policing circumstances. But we have a sister tool called the DV-RAG that requires using the psychopathy checklist, which is a restricted psychological tool that takes a lot of background information. So depending on your circumstance, you may not be able to use that tool. So that's part of that decision about the choice. Communication is another issue. Is this something, a tool that's going to help you communicate back to the people you serve, perhaps to share the information with a victim who has given you her information? How do you share that back with her in terms of a risk assessment result? And does that help her make decisions about her own safety and move forward? Is this a tool that police can use also to communicate with the courts, or with probation, and can shelter staff use this tool with their clients and then communicate with their local policing services about the level of risk in an individual case or in general in the community that they're serving? And my final point is about education. So you've selected a tool. Can you access the education that you might need? Is there education needed for this tool? Is it accessible? Is it affordable? Is it timely? Can you get if you have a crew of staff you want trained, can you make sure that your training needs are met? So I've said a little bit about Adhara 101. I'm not going to say any more at this point, but we do have a showcase out there in the break if you want to come see me there. So just in summarizing about risk management and safety planning, I think both of these processes consist of all the decisions that we make, whether it's about a perpetrator, we need to decide what's going to happen, or in a victim's case, if they're deciding, making a number of decisions for their own safety. We make decisions with relation to risk management and safety planning all the time. And it's always with some notion of risk in mind, whether it's a gut reaction, a gut sense of what this perpetrator might be capable of, or whether it's a structured, validated, scored tool, or however it may be. If we're using structured, validated tools, we can increase the effectiveness of our risk management and safety planning. Actuarial tools especially are designed to work with the principles of effective intervention so that we can be doing the most intensive, the most extensive, the broadest risk management for perpetrators who represent the highest risk. And we can be planning for this at a policy level as well. Okay, well, then, thank you very much for your attention. And I will hand over to our next speaker.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about this challenging topic. So we had talked about how to make this sort of the most practically useful talk, and well, at least I talked about this with Peter. We thought talking about this issue of linking intimate partner violence risk assessment to risk management is a very important one, because it's always been our philosophy that risk assessment is nothing without good risk management plans. Risk assessment is nothing if it can't inform us about actually what to do with the case. But before I get into that, I think I had to put this in here because when I was putting these slides together, my daughter emailed me this picture. This is the puppy that she's finally getting after asking for a puppy for 5 years. So I thought it can't hurt to show a puppy at a conference like this. Yesterday was really heavy, so I'm pretty excited to meet this little girl. So I learned the hard way when I first started doing threat assessments. I can remember I was doing a dangerous offender assessment. I went through, and I thought I was pretty smart, and I went through and I used all the available tools. It was a sex offender who had also had a history of domestic violence. And I did my risk assessment, I sent it into the court, and I got a polite response. Thank you very much, Dr. Kropp, but could you provide us with some useful information? And I thought, well, and I almost retired at that point. But the response was, can you actually tell us what to do with this case? Because what we're struggling with here in court is, can we manage this person in the community? If we place him in the community, how can we prevent him from reoffending? So that experience and others really influenced our approach to developing risk assessment measures. And the whole idea would be, can we develop something like the SARA, which was the Spousal Assault Risk Assessment Guide, was the first tool we developed. There's sort of a one-stop shopping where we can actually guide people through the entire process of risk assessment and to the point where they're making good risk management plans. So it's a process that we're actually trying, with the tools that I've been involved in developing, that we're trying to actually help people through. We think people, regardless of where you're working, whether it's victims, offenders, you are doing risk assessments, threat assessments anyways, whether you're using a tool or not. We wanted to basically guide you through that process in the most structured way possible. So there's sort of 4 general principles or steps that I would suggest are important. The first is to identify risk factors, then to think about the actual relevance of those risk factors, to think about risk scenarios, and then build management plans on top of those scenarios. So let me just walk through this. So when we're thinking about identifying risk factors, you've seen lots of risk tools, and there's lots of these lists of risk factors, and I echo Zoe's thoughts about this. We have to focus on risk factors that have some empirical relevance in the literature whenever possible. So we want risk factors that have been validated in the literature and show some predictive accuracy. Our approach is a little different in that we would also want to include risk factors that we believe might be difficult to empirically validate, but might have some professional and practical utility in the sense that the professional consensus out there is that there are some risk factors that are important to consider that may be difficult or rare or hard to validate. And then there's the whole legal question about using risk factors that are fair, that don't discriminate. They don't use ascribed characteristics of individuals. So, we can't talk about skin color, even if there was, an empirical association between skin color and violent behavior. It's unhelpful to do that. It's discriminatory, and it's not actually addressing what the underlying risk is. So, risk factors need to be fair and reasonable. You'll see, I agree with Zoe that we have to use structure. If we do threat assessments without any structure, we do not get reliable risk assessments. It's as simple as that, and the literature and the research is pretty clear about that. Risk assessments need to be contextual, so we need to always think about the individual case that we're assessing and think about the context in which that violence is occurring in that family. So we believe in thinking about static and dynamic and flexible risk factors in the assessment. So this is just the Be Safer. So this is an example of the structured professional judgment approach to risk assessment. Some of you will be familiar with the Be Safer. It was like our shortened version of the SARA. So you can see we have risk factors related to the violence itself. So we think about violent acts, threats, escalation of that violence, violation of court orders, and attitudes that support or condone violence. We think about the psychosocial adjustment of the perpetrator. So think about general criminal attitudes, behaviors, intimate relationship problems, substance use problems, mental health problems, and so forth. And then finally, victim vulnerability factors. Attitudes and behaviors of the victim, and this is not, of course, to hold victims responsible for the violence that's being perpetrated against them, but it's understanding the vulnerabilities and barriers. So fear, support networks, living situation, health problems, and so forth. So a lot of you work with victims. This is basically the stuff of a good safety plan. This is important because, again, we're going to see that risk management, as I define it, will include victim safety planning. We can't do risk management of the offender without considering victim safety planning with the victim. It's two sides of the same coin. So the next thing is think, well, a risk factor can be there historically, but is it actually relevant? We can go through a list of risk factors and check off a number of factors, but we don't actually think they're relevant right now to the risks that this person poses. So we ask people to think about, does the risk factor actually have some kind of causal relationship to this person's violence? And I'm talking about this later this afternoon in more detail, but we can think about relevance in a number of different ways, but we think about, does it motivate the person to be violent? Is he motivated by revenge, or is he motivated by power and control? Is he motivated by proximity to the victim, affiliation? There's a number of different reasons why men are violent, and women. The other way a risk factor can be relevant, it's actually just going to complicate management for us. So it's going to make it difficult to implement good management strategies. So a risk factor can, we take a decision-making model with risk assessment, and we think that violence is a decision. And what we want to try to understand is, why is this perpetrator deciding to behave this way? So we want to try to, in a way, get into his head and think about what's he trying to accomplish, what might be disinhibiting him, so preventing him from appreciating the consequences of the behavior, both to himself and to the victim. And then what factors might be destabilizing him, screwing up his thinking, just affecting his ability to make good decisions. And it's risk factors that are impinging on the decisions, and that's how we decide which risk factors we want to really focus on. This isn't as difficult to do as you might expect if we actually put in some structure to the process. The next stage we would talk about is developing scenarios. Now, this again is a process where we want people to step back and think about, what bad things are we worried about here? Now, this is something that we do naturally anyways. I mean, anyone that works with victims or offenders has those sleepless nights. You're thinking, what is going to happen tomorrow? Is that guy going to do it? Is he going to kill her? Is he going to abduct her and the children? We are running these scenarios, usually very bad scenarios, through our heads all the time. And that's how we think we build good plans. We can't build management strategies without having a good plan and without understanding what it is we're worried about that the perpetrator is going to do. So we have to think about what that person's done in the past. So we look at all the past and previous patterns of their violence, and that's going to tell us a lot. We also want to consider any development of new patterns of behavior or evolution of IPV. And we can do this kind of by considering a number of different scenarios. So the easiest one for us to think about always is the repeat scenario. We can think about what, is it likely that this person's just going to continue doing what he's always been doing, the same sort of simple pathway. Now the problem with only considering that is that offenders are creative. They can change. They evolve. So we have to not just assume that violence is always going to be the same. A threat assessment has to consider a twist, a possible change in the motivation. The victims, we know that there are possible multiple victims of violence, not just maybe the obvious person, but it might be the new boyfriend, the children, the mother-in-law, and so forth. Are the behaviors going to change? So thinking outside the box, that's how we prepare ourselves. This is how people do this in emergency planning. We have to think if an earthquake were to hit Vancouver, that's my hometown, tomorrow, are we prepared? We do that by trying to imagine all the different possible outcomes. The one we're always concerned about, and it's relevant to this conference, is the lethality or worst case scenario, and I'm going to be talking about that in some detail this afternoon. We always want to ask that question: is this going to escalate to lethal violence? And if it is, how does that unfold? What is going to have to happen for that to take place? If we can do that, now we start to get somewhere. We're thinking about what warning signs we're going to be looking for. We, of course, want to imagine an improvement scenario. Sadly, those aren't always very common. So always consider in our scenarios the nature, severity of the violence, the imminence of the violence, the likelihood, and as I said just a minute ago, think outside the box on the victims, because again, we can have multiple possible victims. We can even have multiple perpetrators, right? So if we think that in extended family violence, sometimes we call this so-called honor-based violence, or on a scenario of that nature, we might have multiple perpetrators and multiple victims. So it can get actually complicated. The notion that intimate partner violence is always one perpetrator, one victim, in my experience, and I think yours as well, is not typically the case. We often have many people we're concerned about. So the last step then, in our process, and this is what we want to train people to think about, is how do we then link the risk management plans to our scenarios, to our identified risk factors. So we're going to target the relevant risk factors. If it's substance abuse, we're going to try to make some recommendations about how to manage that. If it's issue about static security for the victim, security around her home or workplace, we're going to try to address that. We want to specify be as specific as possible as we can. Tailor our plans to individual cases. Every case is different. The strategies, can't say the word strategies at 8:30 in the morning, but they should be feasible, practical, and contextual. So you can go through a laundry list and ask for the world in your risk management recommendations and say, he should be getting this world-class treatment and she should be getting all these support. But if we don't have the resources, it's really kind of a useless recommendation to make. So we always ask you to think, let's stick to reality. Let's make recommendations that are actually practical and useful. And the last point here is that whenever possible, we should be linking a risk management strategy to an individual or agency. So somebody has to own it. Somebody has to take ownership for the intervention. Or again, it's kind of useless. The reports will just drift. Nobody will read them. So who's responsible for what? And a multi-agency approach, I think, is the way to go. I mentioned in the ICAT teams here, it's the multi-agency approach that I know the best, that's used in a lot of communities in BC. Debbie Hamilton, who was instrumental in developing these things, we worked together. I think that kind of approach where everybody can, if you can get through the information sharing protocols and sit together and identify the high-risk cases and work together, identify who's doing what, that's the way to go. I understand it's not always practical, but that's what I would recommend. We have to be aspirational here, try to get to the point where we can do that. But I understand it's not always practical. So the strategies, I've run out of time, but the strategies that we would say, this is a risk management plan. If we can't address these 4 areas, we haven't actually got a risk management plan in place. We have to think about monitoring strategies, very active monitoring, supervision, what controls, restrictions are we going to place on that perpetrator, what treatment or rehabilitation recommendations we're going to make for the perpetrator, and how are we going to enhance the victim's safety. Not any one person or agency can do all this. That's why the multi-agency approach is really important. Agencies need to communicate about what they're doing, and I honestly believe that's the best way we can go with this. I'm really blowing it, I'm sorry, but we actually have direct prompts, questions to ask about those 4 areas, and to remind people what the goal is, what the ultimate task is, and that is risk management. We should really just call it risk management. I think that's a better term for what we're trying to do here. Thank you.
I'm going to talk with you about some of the cultural context that we should consider, including the challenges that we would face when we work with newcomer victims of domestic violence, and in particular, those who are coming from a collectivist background. So, I guess for me, from some of the experience that I have been involved with, as well as some of the research, most of the time when we talk about barriers of accessing services by women who are at risk of domestic violence, or maybe who are victims of domestic violence, unfortunately, from my humble experience, we repeat the same barriers that sometimes actually would not really make a lot of sense. We see, for example, in many cases, like Shafi'a case in Kingston, all the organizations and agencies have done everything the protocol would tell them about risk assessment, risk management, but then tragedies happen. And at the same time, also yesterday, we heard from Maha, the police involved. There is so many things already has been taking place, but tragedies happening. And I think there's some blind spot here when we talk about newcomers, when we talk about really diverse cultural communities. I would really encourage everyone also to maybe ask a question, what do we don't know? Because if you don't know what you don't know, most likely your intervention, your assessment will not be really accurate. So I'm going to talk about 3 main things here. The first thing is really to share with you some of the challenges related to risk assessment and risk management in relation to newcomer families. The second point is really the consequences. If we would not be overcoming these challenges, what would happen? And the third point, really trying to provide you with some key aspects to consider as solutions for assessing risk in a collectivist context. So the first main challenge here, really, just in terms of framework, philosophically, we need to understand that there is 2 conflicting concepts of protection and safety. So many women who are coming from a collectivist background, safety and protection for them really rooted in their belonging with their collective entity. So meaning within a collectivist context, the self notion is rooted within the collective entity. So when you speak with a woman who is experiencing violence in this, from this cultural context, empowerment and self-esteem and all these things are really important, but then without taking into account how, for example, this woman will perceive herself, what is important to her, it really would not really get you in a place where you can really maybe save this person who would be, or this woman who would be at risk. So the second thing that we consider as challenge here, we're talking about different kind of also concept. I'm not really generalizing here. I'm talking specifically about those women who are isolated. Not any woman or any man who is coming from a collectivist background will have the same kind of belief system, attitudes, or behavior. But I'm really talking about those isolated women who already we fail to protect them. And we know many, many cases that we are dealing with. So the second challenge is really, we are talking about families coming from a collectivist background that really role-oriented. So they define themselves based on their roles: a wife, a husband, a father, a mother, and that would have some kind of consequences in terms of really where you situate yourself based on your role, and not necessarily based on your, 10 minutes, thank you. I promise, not 10 hours, okay. So really, basically, it's, oh my God. Anyway, it's important to consider really that the role determine or define, how the decision that you would make in terms of your behavior. Are you going to leave the relationship? Are you going to stay? How far you want to compromise or to navigate the system within the abusive relationship, or maybe going to another extreme, ask for outside help, and what does that mean to you in terms of your role and the consequences, in relation to your relationship with your family, with your extended family. So it's important to understand that concepts to really be able to help women who come to you and ask for help. So the third thing also in terms of challenges, collectivist communities really, they focus more on preserving family is really a priority. And also that's based on the role. So again, also the role of extended family, not only within, for example, the community of origin here, but also back home. We deal all the time with women and sometimes also men who are really at risk of perpetuating violence. You see the dynamic, they connect families back home, and maybe they listen to them more than they listen to someone here who is a counselor or maybe advocate. Shame of betraying the family, a huge factor that maybe force many women to stay within, an abusive relationship. So that all mean really that something that we really need to think about the way we do our service or the way we work with women experiencing violence from a collectivist background. And we need to really to acknowledge there is two systems. The individualistic system of intervention, assessment, and also management, and also the family, the collectivist system of families coming from a collectivist background. So if you don't understand that, no matter how brilliant we are, as Randall said, context is really important. So then that will not really lead us to somewhere where we can really help this woman. So where that would lead to? So really the consequences, if we don't really understand these challenges, and at the same time not doing anything about them, what would happen? So the woman will be at risk, experiencing violence, would be reluctant to outreach formal service. And we have said that several times, everybody was talking about that, not because they don't know the services, or maybe they don't understand the language, no, because that would put them really in a psychological dilemma to make a decision and choices. Are they going to stay within what they know, the devil that they know, or maybe they would try something different, and maybe the consequences will be maybe more dangerous to them. The same thing also with male, who maybe yesterday we heard, for example, depression and mental health, pre-migration trauma, So that also would note as a consequence, this man would not ask for help. We know, for example, generally speaking, men are reluctant to ask for help, but with this context, even more difficult. So that also will increase isolation or social isolation of women experiencing domestic violence. So we also see then, as a consequence, family and community become more involved in protecting the family unit on the cost of the victim. And that happens often. If a woman, for example, go and ask for help, and one would go to the shelter, and then she would not really see what she's expecting, she will go back. And when she would go back, she will be really more at risk. And she'll be more submissive, and she will accept and regret, and that would put her really in more dangers. So also as a consequence of not addressing these challenges, a traditional approach of outage, newcomer women at risk, will fall short of meeting the unique needs of abused women. I mean, we know that we have best practice, we have really wonderful strategies, but if you don't understand the cultural context of these families, women and men, and how they make sense, whether, for example, a man how he justify his abusive behavior, and the woman, for example, how she would, I would not say justify, but really tolerate, the risk that she would live in or with. And that all would really heighten the risk of violence and potential risk of domestic homicide. So finally, those are really some of the key aspects that I want you to think about and to consider to be able to really address, understand, respond to domestic violence, and also help better assess a risk that could maybe lead to domestic homicide. There are 4 aspects that we need to consider. We created a screening tool, risk assessment screening tool. This afternoon, we're going to explain that in details in our workshop. And those are really the 3 areas: cultural aspects, migratory experiences, and the role of religion. In the literature, in the practice, we know those aspects are really important. The problem is we see or consider these aspects as problems. They could be risk factors, but also they could be protective factors. What I'm really trying to encourage everyone here to look at those factors as protective factors, as a strength. So yesterday we heard Maha was saying about the cultural pressure. I think, most of the time we don't have the right lens to address these cultural barriers. In our situation at the Muslim Resource Center, because we are in the middle between the Muslim community and the mainstream service, so then we can create this kind of safe space, so women can come to us, so then we can, bridge with the services. So the cultural aspects in particular, we assess the level of cultural rigidity. I'm originally from Yemen, a tribal society, but not everyone who is coming from the same background will have the same kind of rigidity. It's not about really, judgment. It's about understanding. So some people who are coming from villages, they don't even write in Arabic. They didn't see a city, and all of a sudden they are here in Toronto or in London. So then we need to understand that, because if you just say, okay, here is Canada, you cannot do that. If you do this, we'll take you to jail. That's not going to help. So the cultural aspect is really important. Migratory experiences, in particular pre-migration trauma. 10 years ago, 2 minutes, okay. 10 years ago, I did a research, and I actually found out there is a single question that asks any family, a woman or man, about their pre-migration experiences in general, period, in all these services. Now, after we experience Syrian influx, people coming from Uganda, from any other places, started to talk about pre-migration trauma and PTSD and how that would impact, domestic violence or domestic homicide. So migratory experience is not just pre-migration, also post-migration. People who are coming here really finding difficulties to adjust with the new system. Everything is new. Finally, the role of religion. I know religion is sensitive, but in terms of family relations, many people, religion is really for them a moral reference. They want to make sense of what they're doing based on what they believe in. It's another thing to accept that or not, but we need to understand that if people really use religion to justify violence, or maybe to tolerate violence, I mean, we can always differentiate. It's not really about judging people, but it's really about understanding, how, for example, this person, use religion to justify their violence. In this afternoon, we're going to talk about the 4-aspect screening tool, and also we will talk about how, for example, the Muslim Resource Center has been able to understand, identify risk factors related to migration, culture, and the role of religion in particular, and come up with some kind of early intervention strategies to interrupt escalation of domestic violence that could lead to domestic homicide. Believe me, just one last thing, honestly, it's very important. I have been saying that for many years now. We talk about culture, we talk about so many barriers, but then we need to translate that also into first sharing leadership and responsibility with organizations like ours, the Muslim Resource Center. I'm not saying the Muslim Resource Center, just really culturally based organization. When you want to work with isolated communities, you also need to really understand and to honor the asset that these communities can bring to be part of the solution and not really just being seen as part of the problem. Thank you very much.